When Alex Williams found his father's Marine uniform torn to shreds on his front lawn, he couldn't believe such a blatant act of disrespect. HOA chairwoman Deborah Langley dismissed it as junk, her cold indifference fueling outrage. But when his father's former unit arrived, silence was no longer an option. What happened next proved one thing: honor and brotherhood can never be destroyed. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of sprinklers. Alex Williams stepped out onto his front porch, stretching his arms as he prepared to face another routine day. But as his gaze swept across the front lawn, the easy comfort of morning shattered. His breath caught in his throat. Shreds of deep navy fabric lay scattered across the damp grass, their frayed edges fluttering slightly in the breeze. Gold buttons, some still barely clinging to the ruined fabric, glinted in the early sunlight. A piece of a sleeve was tangled near the flower bed, the Marine Corps insignia torn but still visible, defiantly clinging to what remained. Alex's stomach clenched. A strange, hollow ringing filled his ears. He took a step forward, then another, his body moving before his mind could fully process what he was seeing. He knelt down, his fingers reaching out hesitantly, as if afraid the fabric would dissolve into nothing the moment he touched it. But it was real. The rough wool and embroidered patches were unmistakable. His father's dress uniform. His hands shook as he picked up a fragment of the jacket, his thumb brushing over the remnants of his father's rank insignia. The last time he'd held this uniform had been after the funeral. Folding it carefully, storing it away, preserving it in honor of the man who had given so much to his country. And now it lay before him, shredded, desecrated, like garbage thrown to the wind. A gust of air carried a loose thread away, making it dance before settling in the dirt. The sight made Alex's vision blur with a mix of rage and disbelief. This wasn't just fabric. This was history. This was respect. This was his father. A voice, sharp and indifferent, cut through the silence like a blade. That uniform was a violation of HOA guidelines. Alex's head snapped up. His pulse roared in his ears as he turned toward the source of the voice. Standing on the pristine porch next door was Deborah Langley, the chairwoman of the Homeowners Association. Dressed in a perfectly pressed beige suit, her arms were crossed in a posture of condescending authority. Her manicured nails tapped rhythmically against her elbow, and her lips curved in a faint, almost satisfied smirk. Alex's breath came in short bursts, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He struggled to find words, but the sheer audacity of her statement rendered him momentarily speechless. Finally, his voice broke through, low and laced with fury. "Excuse me?" Langley sighed, tilting her head slightly, as if explaining something to an unruly child. "You were warned," she said matter-of-factly. "Personal items are not allowed to be stored or displayed in front yards. It's against HOA regulations." Alex's fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. "This wasn't a personal item," he growled. "This was my father's uniform. He served this country for 22 years. Langley raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And we respect that." Her voice was detached, clinical. "But the rules are clear. We cannot allow exceptions, no matter how sentimental the item may be." She gestured toward the torn remains at his feet with a careless flick of her wrist. "You can't expect special treatment, Alex." Something inside him cracked. He took a step forward, his entire body thrumming with barely contained fury. "This wasn't trash," he spat. "This wasn't some old pair of sneakers left in the yard. This was history. This was my father's legacy." His voice rose, shaking with emotion. "And you destroyed it." Langley exhaled, her patience thinning. "Rules are rules." Then, as if the conversation were nothing more than an insignificant inconvenience, she turned on her heel and walked inside, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that made Alex's blood boil. For a long moment, he stood frozen in place, his fists still clenched, his breath uneven. His entire body was trembling, not just with rage, but with something deeper, something raw and searing, something that felt disturbingly close to helplessness. The wind stirred again, lifting another scrap of fabric and carrying it across the lawn. Alex barely noticed. His mind was a storm of memories. His father standing tall in that very uniform, his firm voice filled with wisdom and warmth. His father had always taught him about honor, about respect, about never backing down when something wrong had been done. This was wrong, and this wasn't over. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. A dim porch light flickered above Alex as he sat on the wooden steps, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the shredded remains of his father's uniform. The weight of it in his lap felt heavier than it should have, heavier with the memories it carried, heavier with the loss. He ran his fingers over the torn fabric, tracing the golden buttons that were still attached. His thumb brushed over a jagged rip where the Marine Corps emblem had once been perfectly stitched. It was strange. Something so carefully preserved, so sacred, could be destroyed in mere moments. Alex swallowed hard, his throat tight. His father had worn this uniform with pride. He had stood in it during ceremonies, folded his hands behind his back in silent respect at the funerals of fallen brothers. This uniform had been part of who he was, part of the man who had raised Alex with discipline, honor, and an unshakable sense of duty. And now it was garbage. His grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. This uniform wasn't just cloth, he muttered to himself, barely above a whisper. It was a symbol of his life. A gust of wind sent a few loose threads fluttering into the night. The sight made his chest ache, as if something inside him had frayed just as easily. He sucked in a slow breath, willing himself to keep it together. His father had never been one for self-pity. He had always taught Alex to stand tall, to keep his head high, even when life tried to knock him down. But this was wrong. A sharp exhale left his lips. He couldn't just sit here. He couldn't just let this go. Without hesitating, he pulled out his phone, his fingers instinctively scrolling through his contacts until they landed on a name he hadn't dialed in years. His thumb hovered over the call button for only a second before pressing down. The line rang once, twice. On the third ring, a voice answered, deep, steady, and familiar. Alex? Alex exhaled, the tension in his chest momentarily giving way to something else. Relief, maybe, or the kind of reassurance that came from knowing there was someone on the other end who understood. Jack, he said, voice tight. He had to swallow before continuing. They destroyed my dad's uniform, the HOA. They shredded it. Silence. A long, steady breath came from the other end of the line. Alex pictured Jack, probably sitting at his kitchen table, rubbing a hand over his jaw, letting the weight of those words settle before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was calm, firm. We'll take care of this. And just like that, something in Alex shifted. For the first time that night, he didn't feel alone. The days dragged on in tense silence. Jack hadn't called back, and Alex found himself gripping his phone more often than he cared to admit, staring at the screen, waiting for a response that never came. Maybe Jack had forgotten. Maybe he had more important things to deal with. Maybe, after all these years, their bond wasn't as strong as Alex had believed. But every time he stepped outside, every time he walked past that damn patch of grass where his father's uniform had been ripped apart, the anger in his chest reignited. It didn't fade. It didn't dull. It grew. By Saturday morning, that anger was a full-blown inferno. Then, a sound cut through the quiet. A deep, steady rumble. Low at first, like a distant storm, but growing louder by the second. Alex frowned and stepped off his porch, shielding his eyes from the morning sun. The noise wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the street. His breath hitched. Trucks, SUVs, big, heavy vehicles rolling in like a convoy. They came down the road in formation, slowing as they reached his house. The engines growled before falling into silence as doors swung open. And then they stepped out. Former Marines, not just any Marines, his father's old unit. The men moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had spent years in service. They didn't slouch, they didn't fidget, they weren't there to cause trouble, but their presence commanded respect. Alex's throat tightened as he took them in, broad shoulders, strong stances, eyes sharp with the kind of steel that didn't fade with time. Some were older now, streaks of gray in their hair. Others looked like they could still walk into a battlefield and hold their own. But all of them carried the same unspoken bond, the same brotherhood his father had spoken of so many times, and leading them was Jack Carter, still broad-shouldered, still sharp as ever. His presence was as steady as Alex remembered. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never once backed down from a fight. Jack walked up to him, eyes scanning Alex's face, before dropping briefly to the shredded remains of the uniform still resting on the porch. His jaw tightened for the briefest moment before he looked back up. Without a word, he extended his hand. A strong, firm handshake. The kind that said more than words ever could. Alex grasped it, his own grip just as firm. Jack smirked. "You think we'd let this go?" Alex swallowed hard, his emotions caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. I wasn't sure." Jack's smirk widened, his grip tightening for just a second before he let go. "We don't leave our own behind." The words hit Alex like a punch to the chest, not in pain but in sheer weight. They weren't just here for him, they were here for his father. And suddenly, for the first time in days, he wasn't angry. He was ready. The Homeowners Association meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, a routine gathering meant to discuss landscaping regulations, fence heights, and the proper placement of garbage bins. The board members had no idea that today's meeting would be anything but routine. By the time the meeting was set to begin, nearly a dozen former Marines had assembled outside the HOA headquarters, a small, modern clubhouse nestled in the center of the neighborhood. It was meant to be a place of order, control, and quiet governance. But today, it would be a battlefield. Alex stood among the men, his chest tightening as he took in the scene before him. These weren't just any Marines. These were his father's brothers-in-arms. They stood in crisp, formal attire, their postures rigid, their expressions unreadable. The air was heavy with tension. Even passers-by noticed something was different. Neighbors slowed their steps. Curious eyes peeked from behind curtains. There was no shouting, no aggression, just presence. And that was enough. Then, the clubhouse doors swung open. Deborah Langley stepped outside and froze. Her eyes flickered across the gathered men, her smug authority wavering for the first time. She had dealt with angry homeowners before. She had faced complaints, protests, and even the occasional legal threat. But this was different. These men weren't just angry. They weren't pleading for fairness or requesting a second chance. They were standing for something bigger than rules and regulations. Langley cleared her throat, trying to regain her usual composure. She forced a tight smile. "Can I help you?" Her voice was smooth, but Alex could see the way her fingers twitched as she clasped them in front of her. Jack Carter, unshaken, took a slow step forward. His presence alone carried the weight of command, the kind that couldn't be earned through elections or community votes. He was a man who had given orders in places far more dangerous than this suburban battlefield. "You owe Alex an apology," Jack said. Langley scoffed, the forced confidence returning to her face. "For what?" Jack's gaze darkened. His voice, when he spoke again, was steel. "For desecrating a Marine's uniform." The words cut through the air like a knife. Langley's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way Jack's voice carried no room for negotiation. Maybe it was the silent, unwavering presence of the men behind him. Or maybe, for the first time, she realized, no, Tom. She had seriously miscalculated. The silence that followed Jack's words was thick, stretching between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. The crowd around them had grown. Neighbors loitered on sidewalks, peering out of windows, murmuring amongst themselves. Langley's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. She inhaled sharply, then exhaled in a controlled, measured way, as if forcing herself to remain composed. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice clipped. "The HOA enforces regulations for the good of the community." Jack didn't flinch, didn't blink. His stance was solid, his presence unwavering. He let the weight of his silence settle before answering. "That uniform was not garbage," he said, voice steady and deliberate. "It was a legacy. You don't get to destroy that and walk away." His words landed like a hammer against stone. Langley's jaw twitched, her fingers tightening into a clasp in front of her. The board members seated behind her exchanged nervous glances, the tension rolling through them like an electric current. They weren't accustomed to this conflict of this magnitude, of this weight. They were used to disputes about lawn lengths and fence placements. But this was different. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some neighbors looked down, suddenly uncomfortable. Others crossed their arms, wary but curious, their eyes bouncing between Langley and the former Marines. Alex watched Langley's posture stiffen slightly, a sign of forced confidence. She was trying to keep control, to maintain her authority. "I was following protocol," she said finally, her tone sharp, decisive. She clung to those words as if they were a shield. A shift in the air, a step forward. Mike Callahan, a veteran, older than the rest, with a hard face lined by years of service. His eyes were shadowed beneath a Marine Corps ball cap, his hands calloused, arms still strong despite his age. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "And we're following ours," he said. Langley's head tilted slightly, an eyebrow raised. "Excuse me?" Mike took another step, his boots scraping against the pavement. "Marines protect each other," he said simply, "and the memory of those who served." The words weren't loud. He didn't need volume. The conviction in his voice was enough. Langley's fingers twitched. Her weight shifted from one foot to the other. For the first time since she had stepped outside, she looked uncertain. The tension hung thick in the air, wrapping around the small crowd like a tightening noose. The HOA board, so used to dictating neighborhood policy without resistance, was visibly shaken. They had expected routine business, perhaps minor complaints, the usual petty grievances. They hadn't expected this. A line of former Marines standing shoulder to shoulder, a growing crowd of residents, watching, whispering. And most importantly, defiance. Langley's forced composure was beginning to show cracks. Though she held herself stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her as if she could physically hold on to control. Then, a voice broke through the silence. "Perhaps we should reconsider." All eyes turned toward one of the board members, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses and a receding hairline. His voice was uncertain, but there was a nervous sincerity in his tone. Before he could finish, Langley snapped her gaze toward him. "We cannot set a precedent," she cut in sharply, her words laced with frustration. "If we make an exception here, then what stops others from claiming special circumstances? Rules exist for a reason." Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You already did," he countered, locking eyes with Langley. "You set a precedent the moment you shredded a Marine's uniform and treated it like garbage." Langley opened her mouth to retort, but the murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some nodded, their arms crossed as they exchanged hushed conversations. Others looked uncomfortable, as if suddenly realizing they had been complicit in something wrong. A few had their phones out, recording, documenting every moment, every word. Alex stood near Jack, his hands clenched at his sides, but his heart pounded with something new, momentum. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, the tide was turning. Jack let the moment settle before turning his attention back to the crowd. His voice rang out, steady and authoritative, the way only a leader's could. "Let's vote." Langley's head snapped up, her entire body tensing. "What?" Jack ignored her. His gaze moved across the gathering of neighbors, then to the board members. "Let's vote," he repeated. "Let's see if this rule actually stands with the people in this community." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. "Yes. Let's vote. Let's see." Langley's face darkened, her jaw tightening as she realized she was losing control. A heavy silence settled over the gathered crowd as the motion for a vote was officially called. The HOA board members, once seated comfortably in their positions of power, now looked visibly uneasy. This was no longer a small neighborhood dispute over regulations. This had become a reckoning. Langley sat rigid in her chair, her fingers drumming against the polished wooden table, the only sign of her agitation. She had lost control of the narrative. This was no longer about her enforcing rules. It was about the community deciding whether she had gone too far. A show of hands was called. First, a few tentative arms rose, then more. Within moments, The majority of the homeowners in attendance had their hands raised in favor of Alex and the Marines. It wasn't even close. The decision was clear. Langley's expression barely concealed her frustration. Her lips thinned, her cheeks darkened with barely contained anger. But she was trapped. The community had spoken. The murmurs died down as all eyes fell on her. The demand was unspoken, but undeniable. She had to apologize. For the first time that day, Langley hesitated. Her fingers twitched, her throat bobbed in a hard swallow. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight, forced through gritted teeth. "I apologize." It wasn't sincere, not even close. The bitterness in her tone was impossible to miss. Jack, standing tall beside Alex, didn't move. His gaze was locked onto Langley, unflinching. He took a single step forward, closing the small distance between them. The movement was subtle, but it was deliberate. "Say his name," Jack said, his voice low, measured. Langley blinked, caught off guard. "What? Say his name." The demand hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Langley's breath hitched slightly. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. But then she looked past Jack, past the Marines, past Alex, out at the crowd. She saw their faces, the stern expressions, the expectant silence. She wasn't just apologizing to one person. She was apologizing to a whole community that had finally had enough. Langley swallowed hard. "I apologize," she forced out, her voice barely above a whisper, "to the family of Sergeant Bill Williams." The silence held for a brief moment, thick, weighty. Then it broke. A wave of applause swept through the crowd. Some clapped with quiet satisfaction. Others cheered. A few even placed hands over their hearts in silent respect. Alex exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. Not with anger this time, but with something else. Relief, vindication, justice. His father's name had not been erased. It had been honored. The transformation happened quietly, without formal announcements or HOA mandates. A week after the confrontation, the neighborhood came together. Not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a demand. It was respect. Where just days ago the remnants of Sergeant Bill Williams' uniform had been scattered like trash, something new now stood. A flagpole, tall, solid, unwavering. The sight of it made Alex's breath catch as he approached, his steps slow, deliberate. The pole gleamed under the midday sun, its surface polished to perfection. At the top, an American flag waved proudly, catching the wind, its fabric rippling like the ocean his father had once crossed on deployments. And at the base, a plaque. Alex knelt, running his fingers lightly over the engraved words. "In honor of Sergeant Bill Williams and all who served, Semper Fi." The weight of those words pressed into his chest, an ache settling deep inside him. But it wasn't the same ache of anger and helplessness he had felt before. This was different. This was peace. A presence moved beside him. Alex didn't have to look up to know who it was. Jack Carter stood there, silent for a moment, looking down at the plaque. His jaw was tight, but his eyes held something soft, something reverent. Alex shifted slightly, adjusting the neatly restored uniform he held folded in his arms, the same one that had been shredded, now meticulously repaired by the hands of the very Marines who had served alongside his father. The golden buttons gleamed, the fabric was clean and pressed, the insignia stitched back in place. It wasn't the same as before, but neither was Alex. Jack exhaled, then reached out, giving Alex's shoulder a firm, reassuring pat. "He'd be proud," Jack said, his voice gruff but steady. Alex swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He looked up at the flag, watched as it danced against the sky. A slow nod. "We don't let them erase history," Alex said quietly. Jack nodded back. "No," he agreed. "We make sure they remember." And as the flag continued to wave, standing tall against the backdrop of the place his father had called home, Alex knew they always would. The sky was painted in deep shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, rustling the leaves of the towering oak trees that lined the street. Alex stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, staring up at the flag. It moved effortlessly with the wind, each ripple a silent testament to everything it stood for: strength, sacrifice, legacy. But this moment wasn't just about a flag. It wasn't just about a uniform. This was about something bigger: respect, honor, brotherhood. His father had taught him about all three, not just in words, but in the way he had lived his life, the way he had carried himself, the way he had never backed down when something mattered. And now, because of the men who had stood beside Alex, because of the voices that had refused to be silenced, that legacy would never be erased. Alex let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything that had happened. For days, he had been consumed by rage, by the helplessness of watching his father's memory be torn apart. But he wasn't alone. His father's unit, his brothers, had come through for him, just as they had always come through for one another. It didn't matter that the war was behind them. It didn't matter that years had passed since they last stood together on the battlefield. When one of their own needed them, they showed up. That's what it meant to be a Marine. That's what it meant to be family. Alex swallowed the lump in his throat, forcing himself to look away from the flag and back toward his house. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the neighborhood. A few of his neighbors still lingered nearby, quiet, thoughtful. Some exchanged small nods of respect as they passed. A week ago, this place had felt different. Now, it felt like home again. His fingers brushed against the folded fabric in his hands, his father's uniform carefully restored, whole once more. It would never be the same. But then again, neither would he. Some things were worth letting go of. And some things were worth fighting for. With one last glance at the flag, Alex took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward. His father had always believed in doing what was right, and now so did he. So,